Okay, let's get started. There was some questions on Piazza that I'll address today. And we'll talk about, I changed this a little bit before class, but application architecture and a little bit of review. So we'll take a gander at that. Next week, we're going to do persistence on Android. So how do we actually persist this data that we've been saving from the user, that sort of thing. Before we get started, is there any questions? Yes?
Have you gone over already like apps that some other students have made in this class that have been successful?
As in like their finals? Like the finals that they put together?
Like final projects.
That's a good question. I keep telling students to let me know how their stuff went and if they put it up on the store. I don't think anybody has. I could share ones that I thought were successful just from a final standpoint. Just here it is. This is what I made. I don't know if they ever put it up on the Out Store. So is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we can. I can look back through a couple of those. Is Anthony here today? You're Anthony? Good. I accidentally deleted your repository. Not deleted. Revoked my access to your repository. Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you there. Because you had marked it 2015.
Oh, did I put the wrong
Yeah, and so I was going through all my previous repositories. That's what made me think about it, because I used to have all the old repositories from students. I cleared it out. I don't know if you got an email about it, but yeah, it said 2015, so I clicked on it, and I was like, wait, no, that's my student, as I was like clicking on it, and then, yeah, so.
Okay.
Anyway, so re-add me as an admin. Speaking of repositories and everything, with grades and everything, I hope to get those back within 3 weeks of the due date, and so today is the third week, so hopefully I get everybody's grade back on homework 1, and then homework 2 hopefully by next week. So that'll be on Blackboard. All your grades will be on Blackboard. So that's homework 1. So today we're going to talk about application architecture. So I have put together, and you probably can't see that very well. All right, so I put together a UML diagram here. Don't quote me on the exact symbols and everything. There's different symbols that mean different things. I have actually pushed this to the repository already as of about 40 minutes ago, something like that. So you should see this in your assignments/projects folder as project 1 diagram. And this is what I drew on the board last class. And so this is what we did Thursday was when we talked about this, last Thursday. This is what we drew this on the board initially, but I drew it in pictures instead. So on the left here we have our main activity. On the right we have our details activity. And then those both have a reference, because it's a singleton, down to our design pattern repository. And there should be an arrow here. I don't know how to get that toolbar back, but that line should be an arrow. Now, what this is the design pattern repository holds all of our data, and it's just storing that in an array list, which is our first attribute there. And then I have a method down at the bottom called getDesignPatternArrayList. That returns a reference to the array list that contains all of our design patterns. And our design patterns are an object. That's the one all the way to the bottom right. Bottom right, that's what I said. To just contain the data for our design pattern. In this case, just title, description, and a Boolean is favorite. And then, of course, I just shorthanded it. I just said we have getters and setters for all of those for our operations. And then our details activity, which is in the top right, we have a reference, a class, it's a class member, excuse me, to our two text fields, or text views, excuse me. One is for the title and one is for the description. The checkbox I don't actually put in there because I declared it as final. Then I get the reference to it right before I handle the click listener. So I have that slightly different handle there, but you can put the text box in there as well. So this is our class diagram, and so you should, once you have your interface drawn out, you can have these guys as well to kind of help you with your interactions between your two classes, which classes need to know about other classes, which classes contain which data, and then draw the arrows connecting to them to signify that we have a reference to that object. Or in this case, I think the dark black arrow is that it owns that, and so I think those are supposed to be hollow arrows, just to denote that it's not actually owned by that object, but it has a shared reference to it, that sort of thing. But that's UML if you guys are interested, if you ever do software engineering. I'm not an expert, but I draw squares and put stuff in them, and I can call myself a software architect. But this is what I want you guys to do, especially as we get on with our projects and they become a little bit more complicated. Project 1 is super simple. As you can see, we only have 4 classes, but the trick to them is how they interact with each other. And so this is not an interaction diagram, but this is a class diagram. But you can kind of see that, okay, in my main activity, I need to get a reference to our design pattern repository. And if you're not familiar with the singleton design pattern, you might be wondering how to do that. And I was looking at code just this week where they have a file called global, or globals, I guess, and they just stick all these global objects in there. And that's a super bad design pattern. Actually, it's not even a design pattern, or maybe it is, but it's a terrible way of doing things because you don't necessarily know who has access to that data. And with singletons, we can control all that access via the get design pattern array list. We can make that a copy of the array list if we don't want to have anybody directly alter that, so we can encapsulate that data to protect it if needed. In this particular case, I'm not grading you on how encapsulated and protected your data is from other classes and instances of those classes. But if you were going to release code out in the wild, be it an SDK like Volley we talked about last class, you would want to protect that data a little bit. So yeah, don't worry too much about it. But in our details activity, because our details activity is sharing that same exact data, we have a reference again to our design pattern repository. And so again, this is where all of our data is contained. It's also where it's manipulated. If I was going to add design patterns after initialization, so after my app has started and maybe the user's putting in their own design patterns, we would want to have on our design pattern repository an add, a remove, and maybe even a find one type method in order to alter this list. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to, in project 1, is alter the items, their design pattern objects themselves directly. So when main activity, when you click on that details button in main activity, it goes to details activity. It passes the index of the item in the array, in the design patterns array, to the details activity. And so that way, we don't need to pass a huge object back and forth, especially over a method parameter, that sort of thing. And so we just get the index, and we use that index to get the same exact object. And then that way we can get a design pattern instance in our details activity. So I have the code from Thursday that we actually finished up on Thursday, though
Where does favorites fit into that UML?
That's a good question. I don't have it listed because I'll show you why. In my details activity here, I don't have checkbox as a class member. It's just a local variable within the onCreate method here. So this is onCreate. And so I don't have this in my UML. However, you could put it there, no problem. It's just that I'm using that checkbox within my onClick listener. And when you use a variable within an onClick listener, they usually want you to declare it as a final so that it doesn't manipulate that object. But I guess I can stick that. You can stick that as a class member. It's just I haven't, so I didn't put that in my UML document. That's a great question. Yes.
Is there a not tool for UML on Android Studio?
Not that I know of. If you want to go look one up and see.
Like Eclipse has one that will pull out the UML from your code.
Yeah.
And manipulate it.
Yeah, I don't know if Android Studio does, so that'd be good to look that up. So that would be awesome because auto-generated UML is the best, so you don't have to update it. Because if I was to pull this checkbox variable up to my member declarations up here, again, we start those with M's. I usually don't do that because sometimes I forget, but usually you start those with M's. And then what Android Studio has built in is if you hit Command N for the generators and do our getters and setters, we can highlight both of these guys, hit Enter, and you can see it says Get Title Text View. It doesn't say Get M Title Text View. So this is an Android Studio. It knows that Android Studio conventions use the M in the beginning, so it just ignores that. But yeah, that's our getters and setters. But we don't need that for this class, or for this details activity class. So we're just going to do it that way. And so I cleaned this up a little bit after Thursday's class, but really, it really shouldn't be any big surprise. Let me start at the beginning here. Well, the beginning would be here.
Does it matter where we're creating the buttons and the...
Nope. Your interface is up to you.
In different places or in different files. That's fine.
Now, this is just an example. I mean, usually I don't show you how to do the projects, but once you know how to do it this way, project 2, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, use the same pattern for that kind of stuff as well. So I'll show you that in a little bit. But so starting in main activity, we have a details button that you click to get details of that design pattern. So we get a reference to it because we want to set the on-click listener for it. We created an intent using the context main activity this, and then we pass in as a second parameter the details activity class reference, and then we use that intent to bundle up the pattern index. The pattern index I get from here. So this is the bit of code that I added after Thursday's class that I haven't shown you. And I'll go through this really quickly, but the design pattern array list, we get that from our design pattern repository, and again, because it's a singleton, well, it's kind of a singleton. Most of these are just class methods, but I'm kind of treating it as a singleton, that I can get that array from anywhere in my code just by calling that method. I am getting the size of it so that I can do a random number generator to get between 0 and that length. And so if it's 5 items long, it's going to give me a number between 0 and 4. That's why I'm using the floor, because the number that it gives me back is a number between 0 and 1, and then I multiply that by the length. So if it's 0.7 times, let's say there's 10 items in there, and the random number that comes back is 0.71, times 10 is 7.1. I take the floor of that, so that gives me the 7th index. If it was like 9.9, or if the random number that came back is 0.99, that'll equate to 9.9, and taking the floor of that will give me 9. And so that's the maximum number that I can get is 9, because the last index of a 10-element array is 9, right? It's not 10. So that's just I use that line of code all the time when doing random number generation, just getting a number between 0 and the length of the array to pull out a random item in that array. So no big deal there, but then we have the design pattern array list. We get that index, we assign it to this variable, and then in here, well, I should say we save that pattern index in the class instance, which I did not name as M, but I can rename this quite easily by going to refactor, rename, and it suggests, hey, you should probably call this m.pattern or m pattern index. So let me go ahead and do that. So again, that was right-clicking on it, going to refactor, and then rename. And so it renamed it here, but the reason I use that menu item is because it also renamed it up here. You can do a search and replace, that's fine too, but this will also handle it in the context of code. So you might have it in comments, and it doesn't update the comments because it's just a string. Yeah, and so what I'm doing is on the onStart method, so every time that the app either launches or returns back to this main activity, I get a new random number and I set the text title to that. So that was kind of the trick there. And then I'm using that index, that pattern index, to bundle that into the extras of the intent, starting that details activity. And then when that details activity gets started in my onCreate, I pull that design pattern index out. So let's say it's 4. I do that by get intent, get extras, and then that that passes back the extras bundle. And then on my extras bundles, I can get the index here. And actually, I think I could typecast this here to get int, and then that way I don't have to actually typecast the return on this. Either way is up to you. But this way I know that it's getting me an int. You can do it either way, doesn't matter. Whatever your preference is. Okay, so once I have that integer, so I'm just passing back 4, I'm passing back 2, whatever that random number generated in the main activity, I'm now pulling that out of my intent in that second details activity. Using that repository, again, to pull out that array list using that index. So my array list, I think, has 4 or 5 items in there. As I add more, this dynamically updates itself, so nothing's hard-coded anymore. So now I have an actual design pattern object, which was displayed in my main activity. Get a reference to both my title and description text view. I set the text for those to whatever I have in my design pattern, .title and .description. And then here's kind of the trick here of this project. Checkbox equals, I get a reference to it, but then I set the check to whatever that design pattern is. And then on the onClick listener, I set the check. I ask the checkbox, are you true, are you false, checked, store it in there, and then I set that object, that design pattern object. And now because this is a shared instance of this design pattern, it gets populated. So let me just run that. And that's all of project 1, so I expect everybody to get a 100 on it. But it's a little bit trickier than that. And it's not, I'm not expecting you, I'm showing you the code for a reason. It's not to really, you could just copy it into your computer, but to get all these things working in concert with each other, yes.
Well, I built mine differently.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Yep,
Okay.
as long as it works.
It works.
Yep, as with code, there's a million ways to do the same thing, so.
Every time I've seen Heidi in the past week, she's been working on this.
Yeah, and that's why I didn't show you this early on, because it's due next week, so the 16th, by the way. And so if you haven't started, start. Now you have everything that you need. But if you have started, then you might have done it your way and learned how to do it that way, and now you're seeing a slightly different way of doing it. And maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. Depends on the way you did it. There are certainly more robust ways of doing this. This is kind of just the I don't want to say cheap and dirty, but it kind of is. But at the same time, it's really, really flexible by storing everything in that one repository. But I was going to run this so I can show you. While that's loading, I did post a actual tutorial on Android intents. So if you're still a little shaky on intents and how they're used, how to pass information, not only to that second activity, but back from the second activity to the first activity, I have a video up. You can watch that. Hopefully it's everything you want to know about intents, or at least explicit intents. And of course, I tried to change the code, and now it's not running. Oh wow, that's an interesting error. Let's see, so where's my clean? Yeah, I did a bunch of things before class. So project 1 app unspecified. Okay, this was working. Okay, could not, there's the error. Could not find com.support.appcompact. Okay, that's going to be because I might have deleted a bunch of, I was trying to clean up my SDK. These packages get really, really large, and I had an old version on there, so I installed a few of these packages, but that's probably why it's broken. So I just want to install this because it could be quite a large file. It's actually an extras, I think. Yeah, it's one of these that I removes. Android support library. Yeah, so if you ever get those weird errors, like it can't find a library that sounds like it's from Google, one of these repositories should work. I'm just going to actually add a bunch of these. Actually, that was already installed. Okay, so this support repository is not installed, which is probably the one I removed. Install 8 packages. Oh, I don't want these. Yeah, also double check what you're installing. Unless you have a lot of hard drive space, which I don't. That's why I was cleaning it up, but I accidentally removed that. Just click on that guy, hit accept, install that. And while that's taking place, I will switch back. And are there any questions about project 1? Yes, Nick.
So when we're talking about persisting, like say you selected a favorite,
Mhm.
you want to populate your favorites activity. Does that needs to persist through runtime? Like if I hit the back button, it goes away.
Yeah, so if you check it in your details activity and you go back to your main activity, you'll probably see a new design pattern, but if you cycle through them enough times, and that one comes back up, it should be checked. And that's just because in memory, that data object, that Boolean is now true on that. And so when you, in your main activity, in your onCreate, you set that Boolean to be true or false.
So it wouldn't have to necessarily populate a new array with favorites.
Nope. Nope. Yep, just keep the design pattern objects in your array. You can store it there. Okay, I think that was done. Let me try to play that. So the app compat library, whatever it's called, is essentially your support library for supporting earlier versions of Android. Again, I had deleted that package because I was trying to clear up some space on my hard drive, and it complained about it, that it wasn't there, so I knew that it was removed, so that's just what I did, was reinstall it. And just in case you missed that, there's a little Android sticking his head out of a little box, like a download arrow icon here. That is your SDK manager. I think I talked about that in the earlier classes. But you can install earlier versions of the Android SDK, though you really only need the latest to build against anyway. And then there are some extras in here that you can use to build. And yeah, so you could take a look at these. But Google Play Services is important because this is what we're going to use for maps. That's part of the Google Play Services is the Google Maps API. So make sure that's installed if you are having issues. And then any support, compat, which stands for compatibility, anything like that is in your support repository. Anyway, okay, so in my main activity, actually, check. Oh, in my main activity, I actually don't have a checkbox. That's why I don't have it in there. That's right. Okay, so when the app launches, it picks a random item. Let me show you that real quick. Not to give away all my secrets, but just how I set this up. So I have this array list getter, and if it's not initialized, then I call this method called populate array, and that not only creates a new array list, but it also populates it. I guess I have 3 items in here. You should probably have more in your own app, but I was doing this really quickly. So all I'm doing is just creating new design pattern items, sticking in a new array, and that's it. And then returning that array list. So that's what happens. Now this one, all I have is factory. You can make this a little bit more pretty if you want. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult in Android, but you can make it a lot more beautiful than this. Hit details. You can see it says factory again, but it also has a description down here, and then is favorite, so I check that. And now because this is a second activity, I don't have a back button like over here if you're used to iOS, that sort of thing. We use this back button down here. So if I hit that back button, you can see it went back, and this is random, so it just happened to pick the same item. But this is helpful because if I click details, you can see my checkbox is still checked. If I go back, I was going to say, I mean, it's possible that comes up 3 or 4 times in a row. Of course, it has to happen during my presentation, right? But so lazy initialization is another one that I put in here. Detail, click on details. The checkbox is not checked. I'm going to leave that unchecked. Go back, lazy initialization, still unchecked. Check that. Factory. So you saw my code. You saw how I do it. I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm just setting that Boolean in that design pattern object, which is in an array of design pattern objects, and then using that object just to populate my interface when this activity is created. So that's all I'm going to say about project 1, besides the fact it's due the 16th, unless there's any other questions. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Okay. Feel free to email me later on. I'm not going to not answer questions, but I'm going to move on in this class anyway.
So that helps to kind of make the learning curve a little bit
Yeah.
manageable.
Yeah, so I do often show partial implementations of projects. Not that I'm giving away any secrets. I'm not really giving away any secrets there. This is the application I use for UML diagrams, just called OmniGraffle. But that's what I use to use that one. But I did want to get to, let's see. So I have a bunch of windows open here, but in my assignments, projects, project 2 is now posted as of about an hour ago. Oh, and I left the due date there, sorry. That's not the due date. The due date is March 2nd, I think. March 3rd. So March 3rd, I'll change that. I didn't realize I kept the due date in there. I usually don't have due dates in my assignments anymore because I change the due dates and then I have to change 2 documents. So everything's in the syllabus, in case you missed that. But let's talk about project 2. So this is due in a couple weeks coming up here. But it's kind of the same idea. We've covered everything that you need to know in this project already, so there shouldn't be any surprises or anything. And it also uses the same class diagram-ish type stuff as project 1. So this really is not a big step forward, though it's a more useful step forward, at least a more useful application. So let me just read this really quickly. You'll develop an Android app that shows a map and allows the user to place a pin with some data attached, namely a title and description, on the map. When the user taps on the pin, a pop-up will appear on top of the pin on the map showing that data. So initially the app will load a JSON file, which will be on a web server, which I provided in the link or in the description here below. And so you're going to load this JSON file, you're going to parse it, and then you're going to place pins that correspond to each object in the JSON file. You'll also allow the user to place their own pins of their current location and a photo on the map. So you basically have the code for all of this stuff besides the JSON parsing, but all the JSON parsing stuff is in the notes. So this project is more taking pieces that we've already done, sticking them all together in a cohesive, coherent application. And then the photo, you don't have to save that anywhere. That's just displayed on the screen, which I think is also in the project 5, or example code 5, which I've also uploaded to the repository before class. And you can take a look at that. That was the implementation that we did in class, the one I went through to display the camera and the image after getting that working. So the requirements are a map of the user's location will appear with an add button to add a pin to the user's current location. So what you need to do is I haven't done it yet, but I also post the location controller code that I showed you last class. I haven't posted that yet. I want to clean it up a little bit, but you'll use that essentially. You can just use it as is. Tie into that, get the GPS location, zoom in on the map where that location is, and then when a user adds their own location, you will then go and grab that GPS location again in case they moved, and when you add that new pin, use that GPS location. When you're loading from JSON, you'll use the JSON GPS coordinates that are in that object. So when the user taps on the add button, actually it doesn't have to be an add button. It could be, I've seen some people do some creative things here. You can put it in the menu, which we haven't talked about yet. But you can put it there. You can have an add button. You can have an overlay add button. All sorts of different UI patterns that you can use for this. You will use the user's current GPS location, as I said, and then on the add screen, which is another activity, there will also be a button that will allow the user to add a photo to their current location. However, again, you don't have to really store that photo anywhere besides just that second activity. I just want to see that you're grabbing it, displaying it on that second activity, and then we'll diagram this here in a second. I'll show you what this looks like. The app will load a JSON file, and then what you can do, just click on this file, and you can see this is what the JSON file looks like. The beginning element is a square bracket, which means that it is an array, or an array. The first object in that array has a key of name, and that's Bronco Stadium, and then it has another object which is called location, but the value for that is another object. So this is a nested object, and inside that nested object we have a latitude and a longitude. Those latitude and longitudes are obviously doubles or floats, probably floats more likely, and actually they are floats in the lat long implementation, by the way. Actually no, they're doubles, sorry, they are doubles. And then yeah, so initially this will actually change. I'll update this file on the server, and it will also update your application. In the past, students have gotten confused. They've taken this file and embedded it within their application, which is kind of okay, but the whole point is to grab this from the web service, and you're going to use a get because I just loaded this up in my browser. So you can use Volley, you can use OK HTTP, or you can use retrofit, or anything else you find, or you can use the async task method that we also discussed. Whatever you want to do, it's up to you. Take a look at all those, decide what you want to do, and implement it to download this file. But it has to be downloaded, because what I'll do is when I start to grade these, I'll add a few items, I'll change these values so that I know you're not using some static file that's embedded in your application, but you're actually going out live to the internet and pulling this file down. So it's a lot of moving pieces, but again, you have all the code for it, and it's just piecing all these parts together. And that's basically it. So let's architect this. This is kind of what the class is. I have notes for today, but I'm going to leave those to the end because I don't think I'm going to finish on time. The notes are posted if you want to pull those up, but I'm not going to talk about those at the moment. And I do have... All right, so I'm just going to try to remember this off the top of my head, but our activity, our main activity, has a map, and that's likely going to fill up the entire activity, but maybe you want to have an add button up here. There's a menu up here which is 3 vertical buttons on the title bar if you have one of those, and that drops down. You can put it there, you can put an overlay here. You can reuse that mail button that appears on some of these. Like this is a mail button. You can change that if you want to something else. You can look up how to do something interesting. So let's just say this is our map. This is going to be some kind of land mass here. No specific one. But when I tap on a pin, let's say there's a pin here, there's a pin there. I tap on one of this. Okay, so I'm just kind of going through this requirement. This is going to have a title. Let's say the first one was Broncos Stadium, which I guess is called Albertson Stadium. I should probably update that. So something like that, I tap on the pin, and it should pop up the title for that pin. Now, if I click Add, you can have an intent launch this, but the intent doesn't need to contain any extras bundle because it's just going to be a blank default activity. So we're going to have a title here. We're going to have a description. And then what we're going to do is you can do whatever UI element you want. I'm just going to have a button because that's the easiest. Is we're going to have a camera button. Again, could be whatever button or interface you want. It could be a swipe gesture if you want to try to implement that. That's pretty cool, but kind of not discoverable because I won't know about it. Click on the camera button. It brings up the camera intent. Use the code that we have in example code 5 or example project 5 to return that camera to you, and then have a picture. Just say you took a picture of a nice dandelion or I don't know, daisy, whatever that is, and just display it there, okay? And that's all I want you to do. What you'll probably need to also have, just thinking this through, is a save button. And if the user hits the back button, then it cancels it. It doesn't create the location. So let's just say title is I'm going to add this class. So I'm just going to call it engineering building 334. And then a description CS 402, that sort of thing. And I hit save. Now, if you notice, there's no text field for the GPS location. You can put one in just to show the user what it is, but it should be non-editable because usually you don't enter in GPS location manually. You can if you want, but what I really want you to do is get the device's location. And so that's going to happen in the background. So while this activity pops up, somewhere in the background, you're going to go and grab the user's GPS location. And then when I hit save, let's say my user is located here, I hit save. When I hit save, it's going to bundle all of this information up into whatever data structure you want. And when I return to this screen, I better see a pin in that user's location. And then when I tap on that pin, it'll say ENG, yada, 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 with the description. And so in those pop-ups, you can have a title, and you can have what I think it's called a subtitle. I forget. There's another attribute in that map annotation that you can set to put a description in. Basically what it looks like, large, big screen, or whatever you want to call this, 334, is the description here. CS 402. And usually this is kind of like a light gray color. This is more bold and black. And this is what pops up in our pin. Okay, so that's kind of what I want based on this. This is going to be okay, and for those of you that are streaming at home, my apologies that you can't see this, but what I do have is in Okay, so this is a little bit more complicated, but not much. I think there's only probably one or two more boxes. There's only one more box, but I think two more complicated boxes than the previous project, though I think I'm ignoring one of the actual objects. So what I'm calling these pins are buildings because that's how they come in on the JSON, but you can call them locations if you want. That's probably a better name for this. But actually, this is project 3, I'm sorry, but you can kind of see where we're going with this. So project 3 is going to add list views. We haven't talked about list views yet, but just ignore that box for right now. But you can see that I can add a list view, and I have a map view, and it doesn't change my diagram at all. I don't have to add classes. I don't have to pass any other information around. I just know my map view, which is this guy here, knows about a details activity, which is this guy here. Again, you can name it whatever you want. And when I have a list view, which is going to be a list of, like a table view, if you guys, or a table, just a listing of the pins. So right now I have 3 pins on this map. And so when I go over to the list view, you'll have, I'm just going to draw so you can see. Here, so this would be like Bronco Stadium, whatever the other one was, and then like whatever, I guess whatever I entered in here, ENG 334. So this is project 3. So I actually, so don't worry too much about list views, but the map view knows about a buildings controller, and then you can also think about this as the repository of buildings. And in that, just like our project 1, oh, actually this is from my iOS class, but to ignore the types here, the types are slightly different. But I have a array list of buildings list, so that's going to be our array list of buildings. I have an add building class method, I have a remove building class method, and I also have a class method just to get all of the buildings. And so this is going to be how we add and subtract our buildings. The buildings controller knows about the web services controller. The web services controller just has one method. It says retrieve buildings. Again, you can name it whatever you want, but what that method is going to do is it's going to go up to the web services using Volley, using OK HTTP, retrofit, whatever you want to use, to download that JSON object. But it doesn't do anything with the JSON object because this is my web services controller. It's not my, it's not my buildings factory or my locations factory. So what the location services or the web services does with the location data or that JSON file is it then passes it to the buildings factory. And you can see there's an arrow going from the buildings controller, which handles just the repository of all my buildings. It knows about the web services object, but the web services object doesn't know about the buildings controller. So theoretically, anybody can ask to retrieve buildings. And in project 3, which we'll get to, not today, but later, you'll see why that's important, because having a list view, you should be able to call that wherever you want. And the web services knows about the buildings factory. You can architect this slightly differently too, but this is just one way of doing it. And the buildings factory knows how to take JSON data and turn it into a whole bunch of buildings. And so it'll parse the GPS locations, it'll parse the title of the building, it'll parse the description of the building, and then package that up into, let's say, a building object. And you can see that there's no arrows going back to any of the objects. So it's like, okay, I want to load the buildings and they get loaded, but how does the buildings controller know about it? In the buildings factory, once I create these, I could pass it back through these long chains of classes, or I could just post a notification that, hey, I have some new buildings, and anybody that's interested in it can retrieve those. And so when I do the example code for project 2, I will show you how to do that. If you're interested in starting this weekend, you can look at the library called Auto or Event Bus. And Event Bus and Auto comes from The Simpsons, the bus driver. If you guys know that reference. The event bus object is the ability to say, here's a notification of a certain type, and then have any object in this diagram or anywhere else in your application care about that notification. So in my buildings controller, I care that new buildings are coming in. I care that new buildings are being created. And so what'll happen is once that notification goes out, my buildings controller will pick that notification up. And so I don't have to have all these references back and forth. So for example, if my buildings controller needed to ask the web services controller to go and grab new buildings, let's say on initialization, the web services controller downloads that data, passes it to the buildings factory so that it can turn that input of JSON data into an output of buildings objects, and then pass that back to our buildings controller. Now you have a circular reference, which is bad for memory management, it's bad for other reasons, and it's just bad for having all these connections. Not to mention that you can't read the UML diagram after you have all these different connections passed around. What you could do also, another way of doing this is pass it to the web services controller. That web services controller passes it back to the buildings controller as raw JSON data, and then the buildings controller passes that back to the factory. The factory can then return buildings objects. So you don't have to use the event bus, but I like to architect it that way because when you have multiple objects caring about buildings controller, which we'll see about in project 3, when those buildings get updated, well, guess what? List view also cares about buildings being added because it needs to add another item or remove, depending upon what notification it is. I need to know that another building has been added so that I can add it to my list. The map view also cares that a new building was added because I need to add a new pin to the map. And so now we have 3 objects that care about buildings being added. One is our map view, our list view, and our buildings controller. And so instead of having references to all these different things and trying to go from the buildings factory that creates the buildings to our buildings controller, from our buildings controller to the list view and to the map view, we'd have to pass around references to all those objects. So instead, just have the buildings factory say, new buildings, I'm done, I don't care, just new buildings, here they are, if you care about them, great, if not, they go into the ether of Android operating system space. But what happens is list view says I care about it, map view says I care about it, buildings controller says I care about it. Map view says I care about it, it gets those building pins, and it adds it to its map. Or it goes and asks the buildings controller, hey, go grab me all the latest buildings in there. List view does the same exact thing, but in a slightly different user interface. And so we have 2 different user interfaces, map view and list view, that share the same data. Don't pass references back and forth between classes so that you can update those views. It's a terrible architecture. And when you implement it this way, it's a lovely thing. Things just kind of happen magically, from over here in space to over here in space. You don't have to have connections. It's kind of like hyperspace if you want to make that analogy. Yeah, that's the gist of how to architect project 2 minus the list view, which we'll talk about before the next project 3 is due. And we'll talk about event bus and everything like that. You don't need it for project 2, but I highly recommend you look into it so that when you get to project 3, it's just a matter of adding the list view and you're done. You add the list view, you're done. You don't have to re-architect it. You don't have to refactor it. It's a wonderful thing when you use design patterns. So I'm going to hammer design patterns in. And if you haven't taken the software engineering class here at BSU, I highly recommend it. When I took my software engineering class, it was an elective, which I imagine is here too. Oh, it is required? Okay, awesome. Okay. So mine was an elective, and I actually did end up taking it, and it was the best class I ever took because when you build complex, large applications like this, you mostly find yourself struggling with how to pass information back and forth, how to create your classes, that sort of thing. Whereas if you do it right the first time, just adding features like the list view becomes, okay, just add the list view, implement it, get the data from the buildings controller, which already exists, and I'm done. You don't have to tell the buildings controller, okay, here's a new view that cares about it. When you update your list, update the list view, update the map, that sort of thing. So again, we'll go into that in detail Are there any questions on project 2? I will start to code this next week, but it's no guarantee that I'm going to show you the entire project. That's just mostly for your own benefit. I pretty much showed you everything that needs to be done. But if you have questions, ask on Piazza, because if you have a question, somebody else probably has that same question.
So you said we should have this via, but we're not doing list view on project 2. We'll do that.
Yeah, this is from an old. I'll have to update it.
Make sure I was understanding that.
Yep. Yeah, I'll do that later. But so I will push this up probably tonight if I remember. Let's see. Okay, so we got about 15 minutes. I'm going to let me just run through this piece-wise, not the whole thing. Project 1 due February 16th. It is coming up, so get there. Also want to make announcements on the BSU Appathon. If you attend and you present your application, meaning you actually have something to present, not just, hey, I showed up on Friday or whatever, and then I left Saturday morning or I left an hour later. If you actually present, I will provide 5 points on your final grade. So if your final grade, you get a 95 on it, your actual grade with the 5 points is 100, obviously. But I am providing that on your final grade, which is worth 25%, something like that, 30%. So it's quite a big percentage points. The experience is awesome. I think the experience alone will probably teach you about a quarter of what you need to know in this class anyway. So it's very, very valuable experience. These notes are posted, so I'm not going to go through this. Maybe I'll go through this next week. Yeah, I'll go through this next week. So here's just the diagram there. Here's the diagram for project 1 in the notes. This is your map interface for project 1. So just set up your interface. This is what your details activity might look like for project 2. I said project 1. Project 2, so the location name, the location description, add image, you can call camera, save. And then if you also notice that this has a placeholder image that doesn't come for free, you actually have to add it. And one of the ways that you add it is in Android Studio to select, okay, so you put in the image view, and then you can actually set the image to it. I showed this in class, but if you scroll through all those preset R drawable items, they actually have this image in the Android list of default images. So that's what I use to pre-populate my image to say, hey, this is where the image goes. And so when I click on image, it brings up the camera activity. And then when I hit save on that camera activity, it'll pass back the image. I can grab that from disk and then populate it here. Again, you have that source code, but this is where the image should go. Handle rotation too, I forgot to mention. And then I have a demo on Bronco Maps. But so we'll talk about that next week, and we'll also talk about persistence. Let's see. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes. So are there any questions about anything? Yes?
I had to miss one class when I was in DC.
Okay.
One of the things was happening, we were talking about the maps and like Jenny motion, it wouldn't work with the maps. Then you were going to show next class how to fix that. Is it as simple as installing the Google Play services?
Yeah, so Google on Genymotion to install Google Maps and Google Play Services, you download it for your particular device that you have in Genymotion, and then it's a zip file, I think. You drag that zip file onto the Genymotion emulator, and it'll automatically install. There are instructions on how to do it. I can look into doing that for next class, early next class, because I have to find the website to download it, and then a couple other things. But that's a good point. You can always use the AVD, which is what Google wants you to do, is use the AVD. They actually, the Google Play Services used to be in Genymotion, and I have a Genymotion application that's that old, and so that's how I do it. But you can add Google Play Services for the maps later, I hear. I've done it once or twice. But yeah, just use your AVDs with the Haxum installer, the Intel Haxum installer, if you have an Intel processor, which if you have a Mac you do, and if you have a PC, it could be an Intel or an AMD, and that'll speed up your AVD. So yeah, I think everything. I think I did show you the Google Maps on the AVD system, so that's a good question. I'll do that for next class when I show you Project 2. Okay, was there any other questions? Yeah.
You said if you wanted to, we could look at auto and event bus.
Yes.
What resource to look at that?
Just Google for it. Yeah, Android Auto and Android Event Bus, and that'll pull up the websites for those. And you can look at the example code. Usually what I do is when I look at different libraries to use that accomplish things for me like that, is to look at the example code, see how it's implemented, and see what I'm comfortable doing. If it looks convoluted and you have to add, this is not the case, but let's say Event Bus requires 10 lines of code to implement the same thing that Auto implements in 2 lines or something. I'd probably go with the implementation that does 2 lines. That's not true for Auto and Event Bus. I've actually used Event Bus over Auto, but I don't think I actually gave Auto a fair chance. I think, what was the reason I used it? So, Event Bus is by Green Robot, I think. Yep. If you go to the website and you scroll down, they do have a, let's see, yep, a comparison. So you can see how it compares to Event Bus, or Auto compares to Event Bus, and how they declare event method handling. They both use annotations. Event inheritance, yes. Subscriber inheritance, no. Maybe you don't care about that. Cache most recent events, yes, they have sticky events, whatever that means. No, Auto doesn't have that. Event producers, Event Bus doesn't, Auto does. Event delivery and post-threading, yes. By default, Auto, no. You have to implement that. Event delivery in the main thread, yes. Auto, no. So this is actually really important when you're trying to update UI elements, namely adding a pin to your map in, if that's happening in the background, that web services is happening in the background. Well, I want to send a notification out, but I want to have that happen on the main thread so that I can update my UI. Event Bus has that. Auto does not. That's probably the reason why I used Event Bus. And then finally, event delivery in background thread, yes and no, and a synchronous event delivery. Event Bus does and Auto doesn't. So this is obviously from Event Bus's websites. They're probably a little bit biased, but I really do appreciate having those events being delivered on my main thread because, again, you can only update your UI on your main thread, but all these things usually happen in your background thread, be it a web services call or some kind of really intense computation, or maybe even pulling stuff from the database. When you pull stuff from the database, it has to go out to disk, which is a very slow operation, and so that actually happens in a background thread. We usually use async task for that, and so when we use async task, that happens in the background. It gets the data, puts it on the main thread, the main UI thread, and then we can update the UI. But we'll talk about that next week when we talk about persistence. Great question. Anyone else? Any other question? Okay. Thank you, and I will see you next week. If you have questions about Project 1, I'll stick around and answer those as well. Awesome.